Now that the Overwatch League is moving on to a new game, we can keep on the greatest of all time trend for the first era of this franchise. Today we're going to be diving in a bit deeper. Let's talk about the best possible starting 6 for every team during this era. 5v5 is just around the corner, so this is basically the last opportunity we can get to do this. Every franchise has found at least some success at one point or another, and I think it's worth thinking of how good of a team that we could possibly construct for everybody with an all-time starting lineup. Please do keep in mind that Season 5 rosters will not be counted in this. It's Seasons 1 through 4 strictly. Aside from that, there's really no criteria for this. We're just trying to formulate the most talented rosters we could possibly make that also at least makes some sense. Here's what I came up with. Starting off with the Atlanta Reign, their all-time starting 6 is essentially what we saw in 2021. It's when they posted their best results by far, and it's definitely when they boasted the most talent. I feel like most of these picks are pretty obvious. Masa, he's always been pretty solid for this team with the exception of 2020, but overall, over 3 years, he's been very reliable for his franchise, plus he's the only real option at this position. On the topic of support, Iris is the man for sure. As likable as Dogman is, he could never do the stuff that Iris was pulling off last year. Dude was one of the best support players in the game, end of story. Considering the tank line, you could maybe substitute Gator with Pokepo if you wanted to, because Pokepo had some excellent performances for this franchise back in 2019. But Gator has the synergy with Hawk and is honestly just as skilled on basically everything Pokepo can play aside from Winston, and deep down, it feels to me like Gator has had more positive contributions overall, because what he did in the 2019 playoffs as well as the entirety of Season 4 was pretty impressive. As for the rest of the guys, they're all pretty self-explanatory. Hawk gave the Reign more consistency than any other off-tank they fielded in the past. Then you have Pelican, who was arguably the biggest X-Factor player in the history of this team. Words can't even begin to describe how much of a difference maker he was in that 2021 campaign. And finally with Kai, he's just the highest level hit scan they have ever fielded, I'd say, so that's all there really is to it. Yeah, maybe you could pick Edison or somebody else, but Kai just has the highest ceiling. And no, before you say it, we're not putting Defiant on here. Yes, he was a really great player back in his Selfless days, but the fact of the matter is, during his Overwatch League career, it was really short and he only played during the GOATS era, so we don't know what he'd be capable of at DPS, so I'm a lot more comfortable just going with Kai. That's enough about Atlanta though. Let's move on to the Boston Uprising. Their starting lineup consists of Gamsu, Note, Striker, Valentine, Myungbong, and Faith. This might spark some controversy, but if we're talking about things just from like a talent perspective, you could maybe argue Dream Casper. Me mentioning Casper may upset some people, and I can understand why, because he did some pretty disgusting things. However, Boston are really short-handed at DPS, so I think it's worth considering him if we're just talking about, just their skills and everything. It's either Casper or Valentine. There's no other choice, really. But in my honest opinion, Casper was playing at an all-star level before those allegations came up, but I do think that Boston did continue to look good without him anyway, which might mean that Valentine's the better overall choice, since he arguably has more potential. Speaking of potential, that's part of why I went with Myungbong and Faith over Kelix, AimGod, and or Neko. Those three were part of some very good Boston memories, but if we're being honest with ourselves, I think 9 out of 10 of us would definitely take Faith over Kelix any day of the week. He's way more well-rounded. On the other hand, with Myungbong, he has the synergy to go with Faith, plus some insane talent. I mean, he used to carry those Boston teams during Season 3, and I think if you put that variant of him on an all-time team, then Boston would be really strong at support. The rest of the guys on here I feel are just must-haves. The epic trio of Striker, Gamsu, and Note is so important to the early history of this franchise. Striker is quite easily the best player they have. I think Gamsu has the leadership and consistent play that you're looking for, and Note's diva was pretty gross back in the day. I genuinely really like this lineup. You've got the new school players from this year combined with the old school from that amazing team during the inaugural season, and even, just a small highlight from Season 3, despite that year being a very big disaster for them. I just really find it cool that we have so many people from different eras of Boston. Onto the Chengdu Hunters. Much like Atlanta, you kind of just have to go with the lineup they utilized in 2021. Their best performers and highest star power were all in that lineup. Gaga, Elsa, Leave, Jinmu, Yveltal, and Monk is the play for sure. Elsa, Jinmu, and Yveltal were all consistent contributors for not just this year, but the better part of 3 whole seasons. wins. Jinmu and Yveltal have always been making plays since they were rookies essentially, and you have to admit that Elsa in 2021 was really solid. Then you have Gaga, who isn't as beloved as Among, let's say, but is clearly superior with his skills and hero pool. I also think that Monk did a better job than Kyo and just has the longevity factor over Molly, and Leaf simply needs no explanation. Pretty sick lineup overall that does Chinese Overwatch proud. The Dallas Fuel. Now this is one team that I'm excited to talk about. I'm going with their 2021 lineup with the exception of Doha, who I'm actually going to replace with Decay. Come on now, this lineup on paper is gross. We're talking a fearless Hanbin tank line with Sparkle and Decay at DPS. Then you factor in Fielder and you're just unbelievably stacked, practically invincible. That is quite easily some of the most playmaking potential in one lineup you could ever have. Like holy moly, and you've got Jax's leadership to pair up with all of that. As for why I picked these guys in specific, it should be obvious. The 5 guys from 2021 were all part of the most successful roster ever and are the best players at their respective positions in Dallas history. The tough part of this was hit scan really, because both Decay and Effect are really tempting options. They each played the same role for Dallas in 2 different eras essentially, where they were the ultimate hard carry. As much as I do love Effect, I think that Decay's numbers and ability to translate huge performances into wins had a stronger presence to me. I just remember so much about that 2021 campaign. He put up some historic performances, and they outweigh the contributions of Effect by a slight margin in my eyes. This is by far one of my favorite lineups in this video. A team of this caliber could easily take down any of the other all-time teams without question. The Florida Mayhem, considering that the only real success they found came in 2020, you basically just have to go with that lineup, but I'm going to replace Chris with Slime. Slime didn't do much for Florida last year, but if you implement the 2019 version of him onto this team, you might see a different result. Something else that I think will be really great on this team is the tank line. Going back to Fate is going to provide the excellence and consistency to make that Mayhem squad dangerous. We've seen him and Gargoyle do well together, and I think that if you put Fate at the peak of his career in this lineup, then you'll have one heck of a tank line. And DPS, I would say, is probably the easiest part of this team. Yaki's arguably the greatest player in franchise history and a top tier flex DPS, so he's a must. I think Hitscan maybe is a bit tougher though, because I for one think BQB is the guy for the job. He outputted some excellent performances these last 2 years and is a lethal hitscan, but Saya player is also very tempting. He is one of the greatest Widowmaker players of all time, in my opinion the best counter sniper to ever touch the game. I think that him and his prime plus Yaki would be ridiculous, but overall I can't help but feel like BQB has just contributed more on a larger selection of characters. So while Saya player's Widow is top tier, he maybe falls a little short on the other things that BQB is just superior on. And we already know from experience that BQB and Yaki bounce off each other well, so I think that the DPS line should work really good even against other all-time rosters. The Guangzhou Charge. I'd hate to say it, but it's literally just their starting lineup from Season 3. There's potential to implement Nero or Choi Se-wan, but I think you gotta go with Eileen over them simply due to the fact that he was in the MVP race back in the day. Plus his flexibility is practically unrivaled compared to other Charge players. From there, it's rather straightforward. Shu's been a god for years, Krong was also an MVP candidate back in the day, Happy can compete with pretty much any hit scan in the league when he's in the zone. Then you have your defaults, because Rio, he's gotten 95% of the start time for the last 3 years. He's literally the only main tank available unless you'd rather have Jihoon, but why would you? Plus, Rio definitely did have his moments back in the day, so it could be worse, and the same applies for Chara as well at main support. He's always been there for this team, and he's always at least been average to slightly above average in terms of league standards. Unfortunately, I feel that this is one of the weaker lineups in the league. I think Krong, Shu, and Eileen are all great, but the rest of the lineup may not be able to hold their own consistently. Now onto the Hangzhou Spark, which is another difficult team to do. I'm selecting Gushue, Bernard, Architect, Shy, IDK, and MCD. For this roster, I'm going with a mix of the OGs and newer faces. On the OG side of things, Gushue has to be here. He was an MVP level player in 2019 and has shown off one of the best Winstons the world has ever seen. As for IDK, he may not have gone out in a really great way last year, but he was quite serviceable during his prime, which saw him take home a 2019 Rollstar Award and the honors of a top-tier Lucio player in the league. As we transition to the new school guys, I believe that MCD edges out Bebe. It's closer than you might think because Bebe actually was an okay contributor for this team back in 2019. I thought he could play a mean Zen in Moira, but I think the thing that ultimately does it for me is MCD's superior potential and better hero coverage. Bebe can play a good Zen in Moira, but MCD absolutely edges him out with a superior Ana and a Zen with a similar skill level, and we know damn well that he can also play Moira thanks to the Gauntlet back in the day. The other guys aren't too hard to explain. On Hitscan, Shy showed immense carry potential and a solid hero pool last year that definitely does outclass Godsby. Godsby deserves a shout for what he did for this franchise back in the day, but it's clear to me that Shy simply offers more. And while Architect hasn't done all that much since joining the Spark, you have to account for us taking these players at their absolute Overwatch League peaks. And if we're talking 2018 or 2019 Architect, then that makes a major difference because that dude was a stud. As awesome as Bozzy and Adora were, there's really no comparison here. And lastly, we have Bernard, who I believe barely edges out Rhea. Rhea had a very respectable campaign back in 2019, but Bernard's put up similar numbers over the years in worse situations. His potential is certainly greater, and I think that Bernard definitely performs if you put him on a better team that has everything figured out. The Houston Outlaws. OG Outlaws fans are going to be really unhappy with me here, but my lineup consists of Dante, Happy, Piggy, Dreamer, Crimzo, and Jexay. I know what you're going to say. Where the heck is Jake? Where on earth is Linkser? Etc., etc. Listen, I love those guys and I appreciate what they did back in 2018, but the fact of the matter is they just aren't good enough to make the cut. Dante had to be here. He's their franchise player. He's practically done everything since day one. There's no way you could put Jake in over him. And as lovable as Linkser is, Happy is arguably even more mechanically gifted. He's one of the greatest snipers to ever touch this game. When considering the support line, it kind of goes without saying that Crimzo and what he did last year is way better than anything we've ever seen out of Ruckus. Easy no-brainer choice at flex support. If you want to consider main support options, Jexay in my opinion is the best option and the best player to have ever suited up in an Outlaws uniform at this position. Jexay has never been a superstar, but the fact of the matter is that he's been consistently solid on 3 teams across 3 years. And when he played on Houston, I would say that he put in the most work we've ever seen. Putting the heroic Season 3 Jexay on this roster could yield some very positive results. Speaking of positive results, you already know that we had to include Piggy. Meko in his prime was fantastic, but I think that Piggy had the single best season by an Outlaws tank last year, so I'd say that makes him the top choice. Then comes arguably the most controversial decision on here, and that's Dreamer. Muma and Jangu are absolutely here in the running too, but when I think about who I believe has the most potential, I lean towards Dreamer. He not only played decently for Houston last year, but he really showed off a great hero pool for the Valiant in 2020. I prefer his well-roundedness over Jangu, even if he does have the synergy with Piggy and everything, and while Muma was reasonably good back during the inaugural season, he's too resource-driven for my liking, which is why I trust in Dreamer more. He's got the best overall hero pool and decent explosiveness, so I'm comfortable selecting him over any of my other main tank selections. The London Spitfire. I mean, come on guys, this might be the easiest no-brainer of them all. Insert their lineup from the 2018 championship minus Nuss and replace him with Sanguinar, and you have it. Take all of these guys at their peak performance at this level, and they're going to be very dangerous. Prophet, Fury, and Birdring scare me a lot all by themselves. Prophet and Birdring is a DPS line that can compete with anybody out there, and Fury is one of the greatest off-tanks of all time. As for the rest of the lineup, they're all simply defaults. Gesture had his ups and downs, and he's kind of a meme now, but I think back in 2018 in his Overwatch League tenure, he was really good. In peak form, he has an excellent Winston and Orisa, and honestly, the same goes for Badoshin. Back during 2018 and 2019 even, he was quite the respectable Ana and Zen player, and we even saw him just be really flexible in general during the 2018 playoffs. Not that it would matter in this format since everybody's in a role lock, but still, it's worth mentioning that he can flex. Sanguinar doesn't blow you away, but I think that he's a pretty intelligent player. He makes good decisions, he does a good job of staying out of trouble, and he can do the dirty work when needed. He's just a good all-around option, and I think he'd be an upgrade on that 2018 roster if he was there at the time. The LA Gladiators. Now this is easily one of my favorite lineups, I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm rocking with Fissure, Void, Shu, Moth, Kevster, and Birdring. Tell me that lineup isn't fire. It's the best of all worlds. You have former champions, too, a matter of fact. Then you have the whole Chengdu Panthera connection going on with Fissure, Void, and Birdring. They're going to synergize well. All of these guys in their primes are also just top players in the world in the Overwatch League. There's so much consistency and playmaking in this one lineup. Fissure was once regarded as the best main tank in the league, in the world if anything. Void has arguably been the best off tank in the league for 2 years. You have Moth, who might be the best main support in league history, Shu, who just came off an MVP level year with this franchise, then Birdring and Kevster, who are some of the best DPS players you could honestly have. I really have nothing else to say. This lineup is so clean. The LA Valiant. When you think about when this franchise was legit, you lean towards Season 1. That's going to be the base of my roster. I'm selecting Fate, Space, Kariv, Custa, and Agilities from this era, but I'm replacing Soon with Kai. It's nothing personal, I really appreciate Soon, but when you think about who carried this team more, it's definitely Kai. And I think just in terms of pure sniper potential, Kai has him beat. There's going to be a Tracer issue for sure, but I'm willing to live with the consequences. But why all inaugural season guys aside from Kai, you may ask? Well, the options really aren't that good, you know? Space and Fate are by far the best tanks available. Just look at their consistency over their careers. I mean, it's pretty crazy. Why would I not want them as my tank line? And when you think of pure hard carry performances, I'd say that Kariv's selection is also warranted. Lastro's a great fit here as well, but Kariv's contributions the first 2 years are simply more impressive. Take Kariv playing out of his mind in 2019 and plug him directly into this roster. Sounds pretty good if you ask me. What might not sound as good to a lot of you though is Agilities and Custa, which I'd like to add is understandable. This team needed a leader though that everybody looks up to and some sort of projectile specialist, and I think that Agilities and Custa fit the bill. Maybe I'm just too biased here when I say this, but there was a time when Agilities was decent and seemed like a player on the rise. The second half of 2018 and parts of 2019 showed exactly why he got a contract to begin with. He's excellent on things like Pharah, Genji, and Doomfist. And if you put a young Agilities who still hasn't fulfilled his potential on this roster, then maybe he becomes better at some of the other stuff you need him to play. He's not the most appealing option on paper, I admit that. But there's not that much of a choice if we're looking for a real flex/projectile specialist. You could go with KSF, but I'd say that Agilities has contributed more, and while Shax is also pretty appealing, he just doesn't have the hero pool we're looking for. With Custa, the race is a bit more tight. He's not the most mechanically skilled guy out there, and because of that, you can make a great argument for Rain, who had a pretty underrated year for the Valiant in 2020, but Custa undoubtedly means a lot to this team in terms of communication and leadership, and he's not an awful Mercy, Lucio, or Baptiste, so it could be worse. Custa was a really important part of the Valiant for nearly 2 years, meanwhile Rain was just there for 1 year and that's it. If you're going for pure skill, then maybe Rain is the better fit, but there's more to this game than just that, and I think that Custa fits the need. I'm fine with this roster. It's not great, but as a former Valiant fan, I love it. The New York Excelsior. As much as I want to get spicy, I can't get myself to do it. The answer is all Season 1 players. You got SBB and Libero at DPS, Mono and Meko at tank, then Animo and Jonek at support. Sorry Arc enthusiast, but Animo's just a better choice. Arc was great in 2018 for sure, but I think that the NYXL clearly saw Animo as the better player in the long term. And honestly, I'd have to agree. Animo has always been a respectable main support who has the immortal Mercy that Arc had, but with a noticeably better Lucio, Baptiste, and Brigitte. If you're trying to win, you have to go with Animo. In terms of more debatable picks, I could maybe see some backlash for the SBB or Libero picks. After all, this team did have Hoxel at one point and currently have a rising star in Flora, but you know, when I think back to when the NYXL were a legitimate threat, SBB and Libero were at the helm. Libero used to be a top flex DPS in the game, and SBB is a former top tracer in the world. Their leadership and combined mechanical prowess is what I'm looking for. I know for a fact that these two can coexist, and I trust them to compete with other top-tier DPS players if we take them at their peaks. The rest of the selections are rather easy. Jonek at his best was influential to the game and was one of the best players on the planet. Not to mention that he's actually the only flex support to have ever worn an NYXL uniform, so he's in by default. Then we have the tank tandem of Mono and Meko. Much like Sabiobi and Libero, these two were staples in the early years of this franchise. Mono to this day is still widely regarded as one of the best main tanks in league history. He was a superstar all 3 years that he played here. When it comes to Meko, I don't think any other NYXL off-tank really compares, because let's be honest, that tank line was never quite the same after Meko didn't get a new contract in 2020. They tried their best to replace him, but nobody quite lived up to his reputation. I know it seems like ages ago, but Meko genuinely used to be one of the most respected off-tanks in the Overwatch League. He was one of the rocks of this franchise during their early endeavors. He always came up clutch when needed. If you want more proof of his greatness, Meko has the 8th most eliminations in Overwatch League history, and keep in mind that he played on a weak Outlaws team in 2020, and he didn't play at all in Season 4. That's more eliminations than Jonek, Mono, and Birdring, who all have way more playtime. Meko was a great player, and I think that if you put him in the prime of his competitive years in today's league, he'll still hold his own. This is simply an epic throwback team. They had the synergy and confidence to be a top team for multiple years, and I think that has to be worth a lot regardless of how much the game has changed. The Paris Eternal. This one hurts. Not so much because I hate the roster, but because I can't put any of the guys from 2021 on here. I desperately want to, but it would be foolish to not scoop up that 2020 starting lineup, which is objectively their best ever. As much as Don impressed me last year, I'm going to be taking Ben Best, as I thought he was still a little bit better at his peak. Plus, him and Hanbin have already proven to work well together, so that's a good bonus. Hanbin, Sparkle, and Fielder are all pretty self-explanatory. They're here for the same reason they made the Dallas roster. They are MVP level players. But what about Xe and FD God? Well, Xe was also MVP level back during his prime when he was actually in the league and could compete with just about any hit-scan player in the game. Simple enough, right? And while FD God didn't work out great for the Shock, he most certainly did for the Paris Eternal. His Lucio's one to be feared, and his Brig was actually serviceable back then. This team might not necessarily thrive in every single meta, but they'll do pretty well a majority of the time, especially if we factor in Sparkle at his peak where he does have a good Tracer and Echo at his disposal. Honestly, this really just is a better version of 2020 Paris. Multiple players have made additional strides in their games, and we're accounting for that here regardless of if they were on Paris or not when it happened. That's enough about Paris though. Time for the Philly Fusion. I'll be honest, I really like the mix here. I decided on Carpe, EQO, Mono, Fury, Funny Astro, and Alarm. I feel that most of these we're going to agree upon. Carpe is the face of this franchise, so no questions there. Then you have Alarm and Funny Astro, who are one of the best support duos in League history. I mean, Alarm in particular is just a generational talent, one of the greatest flex supports of all time. Easy clap in that regard. You know who else is an easy clap? Fury. If I called him an all-time great for the London Spitfire section, you already know that he's got to be on here too. Fury plus Mono together at their best sounds incredible. Speaking of Mono, main tank is way up more for debate because Sato was excellent in 2020. But when you think about consistency over large stretches of time, Mono comes out on top. Man was a stud for 3 years. Also, he's not quite as resource dependent as Sato, at least in my opinion. And that is pretty important when considering how good it is to keep the resources on Carpe and Alarm, who are the main playmakers of the squad. So yeah, I can comfortably say that I prefer Mono over Sato when it comes to peaks of their careers. Mono had one that lasted for so long, and I mean, their skill levels are pretty similar on all heroes, so why not? If you're wondering why I went with EQO over somebody like Ivy, it's essentially for the same reason. Ivy was excellent, but he didn't really play every single game back in 2020. Meanwhile, EQO has served this team well for multiple years. It wasn't always pretty, but he had a lot of great moments right from the start. He was a massive contributor at Philly's biggest points of relevance. He was a big help for them in Season 1, and their playoff run as well during that time, and he played a huge role in that Summer Showdown Finals. I'd say that warrants his selection. EQO, when he's feeling it, is respectable, and some people forget that he can do more than just play Genji. He's genuinely a somewhat versatile player who can play both hit scan and projectile if needed. I know some people will disagree because some of these selections are maybe a bit questionable, but I like this Philly lineup. You've got the Season 1 OGs, the 2020 Dominators, and a wildcard like Mono. Pretty cool team. The San Francisco Shock. Despite fielding some incredible talent, I found this decision to be incredibly painless. We're going with Smurf Choi at tank, Violet Moth at support, and Striker Rascal at DPS. Before my Super and Aunt Malders throw a hissy fit, hear me out. As marketable and as amazing as Super has been, Smurf is more flexible. The only character I really find Super better on is Reinhardt, and if we want a team that can maximize their chances of winning, then Smurf is who you want on your team. There's a higher chance of the main tank position making the hard carry plays in this scenario because Smurf is an absolute god. Meanwhile, I admit that not going with Ans could be a little strange. He is a generational sniper after all, but we need somebody who can be more flexible. We need somebody who can do more of the niche stuff like Mei and Echo or whatever else the meta might call for, and that's where Rascal comes in. Plus, some people forget that he could literally play just about anything he wanted to. I trust in Rascal to get the job done, and while Striker has no ons, he's still a great hit scan in his own right. Plus, I feel it would be a major mistake to not capitalize on his world-class Tracer. That's an insta advantage over most of the competition. He's one of the all-time greats. I need Striker here. He's a must. You know who else is a must? Violet and Moth. This duo had great moment after great moment for 2 years. Each of them are one of the best ever at their respective positions. I think that Violet and Moth in their prime is something you don't want to deal with. It's the perfect balance of aggression and conservative, but they also could both make the big plays when needed. I'm pretty confident this lineup could beat just about anybody. They're dirty in almost any meta, but that's enough about the shock. You all get it by now. They're fantastic. So how about we talk about the Seoul Dynasty? Maybe this lineup could surprise some of you, but I'm going with Marvel, Michelle, Fleta, Prophet, Ryu Jae-hong, and Toby. Let me address the whole DPS situation first, because that's going to be the thing that gets people talking. So Prophet and Fleta, obviously they play the same position and they have some overlap with their hero pools, but at the same time, they really don't when you truly think about it. They're two of the most flexible DPS in League history. Fleta has proven he can play hitscan at an elite level, has he not? Might as well capitalize on all that flexibility to give you the ultimate 1-2 punch at DPS. I appreciate Fitz and his development over the years. He's also a natural hitscan, which may seem a bit more appealing on paper to a lot of you, but it feels to me like I might be missing out on a cool opportunity if I went with him over either Fleta or Prophet. They're going to ensure that we can run just about any DPS in the game if we wanted to, any combination. People are going to act like Fleta couldn't thrive on any role he wanted to at DPS, but we've literally seen him do it all already. Plus, I mean, Fleta definitely has the better peak compared to Fitz, and the same with Prophet. Fleta literally won an MVP award and has been a superstar since his very first game at the Overwatch League level, essentially. I could really see both Fleta and Prophet coexisting. Neither of them are what you'd consider to be overly selfish players, so maybe it could work. It's a big risk, but it also could be quite rewarding, as they are two of the greatest DPS players in League history. But of course, some attention is probably drawn towards the tanks here as well. Fissure is right there for the taking, and you already know how I feel about this guy. Not to mention that Zumbo was also really good back in the day, but when I think back to Seoul's success in 2019, a lot of it actually revolved around the play of Marvel and Michelle. In my honest opinion, Seoul's tank situation was at its absolute best during 2019. Also, the two of them in 2019 were mad underrated in my opinion. They're a really strong duo. From how Seoul has played in the past, they revolve a lot around unselfish play. In my opinion, that's always been when they've been at their best really throughout the years. When they take it slow and just have everybody really work together rather than investing in one or two guys. Somebody like Fissure is a lot more demanding resource-wise, and that could potentially screw some things up. So might as well stick with what we know works, and if we're doing stuff that works, that should already explain why Jae-hong and Toby are on here. Seoul's support line was at its best when the two of them played together, especially in 2019. With years of experience under their belts working together, you know you can count on them. Jae-hong is one of the greatest support players in history, and Toby is no slouch himself. These two can hold their own, and I especially feel this way if we take peak Toby from 2020. Him and Jae-hong could probably reach new heights with what they're capable of. You absolutely should not sleep on them. Admittedly speaking, this team is really weird, but it's probably one of my favorites. There's a lot going on here, and I think it would appeal to a wide range of longtime Dynasty fans. The Shanghai Dragons. Okay, I feel like this is a pretty simple one, with the exception of main tank. Let's go with Lip, Fleta, Izayaki, Lee Jae-gon, Void, and Fate. The first 5 are all insta-locks. They were all part of the dominance this franchise has showcased over the last 2 years. They've all proven to be top players in the world, and we know they can play around each other. It all really comes down to main tank. Do we go with Fate since he was part of the championship roster, or do you pick Fearless who has the bigger carry potential, most would say? Fate works pretty well here since he complements the other guys on the roster very well, and he's great from a flexibility standpoint. He can play a mean Orisa and Wrecking Ball, which is pretty important here in the modern era. On the other hand, Fearless can completely take over a game. I mean, he can hard carry you, and aside from Orisa, he's got a pretty good hero pool. But you know, just like with my Marvel over Fissure selection, I feel it's a better idea to not have too many resource-dependent players. Fate is way more about just setting up his teammates, and with every great team does come a good balance, so despite Fearless being the better individual player, Fate probably means more to helping this team succeed. Plus, Fate was the one on the championship roster overall, so I'd say Season 4 Shanghai Dragons for the win here. The Toronto Defiant. Ah yes, one of the more forgettable franchises in terms of player talent. The play is probably like a Korean squad, right? I could maybe go for Prime Surefour or Logix, but why put this roster at a disadvantage with communication? This lineup will consist of Sato, Michelle, Hisu, Ivy, Kariv, and Roki. The cool thing about this roster is a lot of these guys could be really good if you take them at their absolute best. We're talking Sato and Ivy from 2020 Philly, Michelle from 2019 Seoul, Hisu in his current state or maybe 2020 Philly as well, and then 2019 Kariv and Roki. These guys aren't world beaters, but they're not terrible. You may even consider them to be a dark horse of some sort if you were to pit all of these rosters against one another. It just sucks that Toronto hasn't had more superstars throughout the years. I especially think they're hurting at main support, where the options are very limited. You've got dependable members on this roster, but they just won't compete at the level you'd hope they would, most likely. Not enough superstars and too many exploitable weaknesses. That's about it for Toronto, so let's move on to the Vancouver Titans. And simply by looking at their history, this is a very, very easy one. My team is Hangzhou, Twilight, Slime, Stitch, Janu, and Fissure. Hangzhou, Twilight, Janu, and Slime are all must-haves. Hangzhou's an all-time great flex DPS and a former Rookie of the Year. Twilight is one of the greatest flex supports in League history. Janu had one of the single greatest seasons by an off-tank back in 2019, and Slime, quite honestly, is the best main support this franchise has ever had, and it's not very close. Where some people might get a little mad at me, though, is what I decided to do at main tank and hit scan. Where on earth is Bumper? Well, to be completely honest with you, I don't think he's the right fit. Remember that I'm only including players during their Overwatch League tenures, and while Bumper was very fun to watch, he did have a rather unorthodox playstyle. But also, the fact of the matter is, he did have some attitude issues according to everything that I've seen online, as he apparently didn't always take practice and being in the league seriously, and that's not what a team needs, especially when the competition is this intense. Fissure might have had his fair share of issues in the past as well, but I think it would work out if we put the Season 1 version of him on the squad, where he genuinely was more motivated to play, and with him being on an all-Korean team, he wouldn't have any sort of falling out like he did on the Glads most likely. And I mean, in general, Fissure has just been the better player in my eyes. I prefer him. He has the superior hero pool, the higher peak, and the ability to carry a team harder. So that's all good and well, but why Stitch over somebody like Solminsu, who was genuinely really important to the team's success in 2019? Well, I'll tell you. This team needs a legit hit scan and a decent tracer. Solminsu was known for Zarya and Reaper, but we just need more. Although Stitch didn't contribute much in 2019, he showed prowess during 2020, both during the early weeks on Vancouver before they all parted ways, and during the playoffs on Washington. He showed he still had something left in the tank on characters like Ashe and Hanzo and Sombra. He's not incredibly appealing, and I think his peak at this level is very minimal, but Stitch is the best we've got if we don't want to sacrifice synergy. And finally, we have the Washington Justice. Now, this team on the surface feels kind of whack, but they aren't too bad when you really think about it. I'm rocking with Decay, Tuba, Mag, Fury, Arc, and Aim God. A few of these guys make sense. Fury's literally already made 2 teams, and no other Justice off-tank really compares. And I think the same applies for Mag and Decay as well at their respective positions. Regardless of how things went down in 2021, these 3 on paper give you a lot of potential. Decay and Fury at their best will surely lead to some great results compared to what we saw in real life, probably better. It's the other 3 guys on this roster that really require an explanation. Tuba might have been a one-season wonder of sorts, but you have to admit that his impact and value to the team was pretty high back in the day. His Genji was basically their saving grace during the Summer Showdown, not to mention that his Sombra, Pharah, and sometimes his Tracer were pretty great during that playoff run. Maybe Assassin has the greater potential, but I think that Tuba has the consistency that you're looking for, and after what we saw in 2021, I'd say the Justice could use all the consistency they could possibly get. But how on earth do we explain the Arc and Aim God selections, you may ask? Well, try and recall that I'm taking these players from when they were at their best, not necessarily when they played for said team, and I think that if we take 2018 Arc and 2019 Aim God, they're not too bad. I especially have high praise for what Aim God did back in the day on Zen and Ana. I trust these 2 to look a lot better than what we saw during Season 3 under these specific circumstances, and although this support line still isn't spectacular, it's still better than Closer and Bebe at any point in their league tenures in my opinion. Maybe I'm alone on this, but I find this lineup pretty likable even if they aren't the best. They'll be fun to watch, that's for sure. But that pretty much concludes my thoughts on the Washington Justice, which means that we have finally reached the end of this video. So now I'm gonna ask you, what do you think? Out of all 20 teams, what's your favorite roster that I made? And what would you have done differently for some of these teams? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more Overwatch 1 all-time rankings content just like this, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And as always, I want to thank all of you so much for watching this video. I appreciate your support. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.